when you look at, how much money these banks have, I mean, those fines are nothing to them, especially when, the financial criminality being prosecuted creates profits 10 times the amount of the fine. I mean, it was worth it for them at the end of the day. They have no incentive to change their behavior. So I think for us to believe that they're all of a sudden altruistically concerned about people in the global south and the planet and the environment,
In this discussion, Whitney dives into the hidden financial implications of
In this discussion, Whitney delves into the hidden financial impacts of tokenizing natural resources, the economic exploitation of developing countries through debt politics, and strategies to prepare for a potential economic crisis. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel. Now let's hear more from Whitney Webb.
Let's take the case of the Green Plus program, which claims to sort of tokenize and turn into carbon credits protected areas throughout Latin America. So in those cases, the carbon credits aren't given to the locals or the local governments to trade and make money off of and put back into their communities. It's going through third parties that are not based in those countries. And the money for the people there go into a particular fund that isn't managed by any people that live there. It's managed by, well, they haven't really been open about it, but a guy from one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, Locked-in, is ostensibly the head of it. And they would decide when there would be certain allotments of that money, and that money can only be spent on projects that this particular group running Green Plus, that again isn't based in Latin America, approves of. So in that case, you're sort of choosing how the money can be spent. You're framing it publicly as for the benefit of the environment and for the benefit of these local people. But in reality, you're deciding what they can and can't fund. Some of the stuff that, their partners and whatever are tied to a lot of the same foreign oligarchs, like the Rockefeller Foundation or the Gates Foundation, or entities, like that go back to some of these, very wealthy families. Ultimately, it's initiatives run by NGOs that those organizations fund, which ultimately doesn't necessarily work in the best interests of these local people who are poised to surrender these protected areas, supposedly to protect them by generating carbon credits. But the carbon credits are going to be traded by people abroad, and the decisions about how that money is spent is being made by people who are abroad, not about the locals. So it sort of seems to me like a way to frame a project that's going to make certain people a lot of money under very different terms than what is actually going to happen. It seems more likely to disenfranchise rather than empower locals, but is being framed sort of as a planetary necessity because of the whole, climate change thing, right? So we have to act now to do this stuff. And so there's, this pressure being placed through that rhetoric on people to comply with these types of things, particularly in Latin America, is a big focus of that now. But I think, as it's been, played out in practice, that really isn't the case. And the particular group that I mentioned earlier that's doing this in the Amazon, which is called One Amazon, entered into contractual agreements with this indigenous community called the Shuar, I believe, that live in the Amazon. And it was framed to them as being great. And then they actually went and read the contract after they signed it and realized that it dramatically favored One Amazon over their interests, and then voted to cancel the agreement. So these guys kind of have a history, at least these actors that I've mentioned, of sort of going in and framing their stuff, making a sales pitch to locals that it's going to be great for them, and then when it's not in practice, the locals are trying to get out of it. So that should really tell you a lot about what's going on here, I think. A lot of the powers that are affecting sort of this natural capital agenda right now are inherently predatory institutions. And so I think their interest is in exploiting, which has been historically what has happened to Latin America in the colonial and post-colonial era. And I think this perhaps may be a more creative way of dressing up the same game to make it look different. The goal here is to sort of financialize and monetize what previously have been the global commons. So for example, there was this effort that was spearheaded by a Rockefeller Foundation connected group called the Intrinsic Exchange Group. They partnered with the New York Stock Exchange to create this new asset class and asset vehicle called the Natural Asset Corporation. And basically how these NACs are said to work, at least as far as the architects of it have said, is that, this group goes and identifies a natural asset that nobody owns, and then they sort of have an ICO and sell shares in that, and then work on generating profit for their shareholders, and then allegedly will use that money to towards conserving the asset and all of that. But conserving the asset, for example, could mean not letting anyone or any locals go near it. And these natural asset corporations could go and, I don't know, claim on a lake in Chile, for example, and say no one can use it. But what if a bunch of local people fish in it and aren't necessarily damaging the lake? At least in Chile and Argentina and maybe other Latin American countries, water, even if it's, you know, a lake or a river that touches a privately owned property, that's, you know, part of the commons. So the Intrinsic Exchange Group frames this natural asset corporation as creating a whole new asset class that dwarfs the existing asset classes we use today. And they referred to that as nature's economy and as the opportunity in unlocking nature's economy. So really it's a way to create this huge, in my opinion, massive asset class that will allow them to continue really what is the Wall Street casino, allow it to continue, allow them to continue their bad behavior into the new era, but are just going to be sort of taking ownership of natural features and, you know, making these corporations around them and then using them really essentially however they like. Because in theory, you know, you could have a natural asset corporation and through all these carbon markets and all these other mechanisms that are being created, you can buy offsets or other things to sort of justify whatever you want to do to any sort of land you take ownership of, and sort of frame, you know, this whole system is benefiting the environment. But really, I don't really think it is that, because a lot of these natural capital things have been developed by JP Morgan or, you know, people like Mark Carney, who was, you know, a former banker of the head of the Bank of England, head of the Bank of Canada, also helped cover up the HSBC drug cartel money laundering scandal, among other things. And these are the kind of people that are sort of designing these supposedly sustainable development systems, but a lot of it involves debt politics as it relates to, you know, global South economies, this idea in the sustainable development goals of having sustainable debt levels and all of this stuff, and how debt is an important part of financing the sustainable development goals, and how a lot of these ideas of financializing nature, they say it'll give nature monetary value, but it also allows nature to be turned into financial instruments that, you know, in the hands of these predatory financial institutions could just essentially become fodder for their casino at the end of the day. And I think that's not really a good thing. So I think we should look at the history of these institutions and not necessarily, you know, believe at face value what they say of, you know, this is good for the environment and whatever. I don't really think that's necessarily the case. If you look at, you know, groups like the Nature Conservancy, for example, that are sort of a pioneer in this field, they've been intimately connected with Wall Street for a very, very long time. Henry Paulson, who I mentioned earlier, the former Goldman Sachs guy that was head of the Treasury Department when the 07-08 crash started, was chairman of the Nature Conservancy for a long time. And they have a lot of involvement with JP Morgan people. They're pioneering this whole idea of the debt for nature swap. That if countries implement plans the Nature Conservancy designs for land management, for example, they'll be able to restructure part of their debt and all of this. It's sort of, I would argue, a way to use the huge debt load that Latin America has been saddled with through their relationships with entities like the IMF and the World Bank, a way to sort of offer them an out, quote unquote. But it's not necessarily an out, it's sort of a way into this new game, I guess you could say. And so I'm sort of concerned about it in that sense. And I'm also concerned that a lot of these same entities too, you know, if you're going to turn like the natural world into a commodity, you know, a lot of these banks that are involved, like JP Morgan, for example, have a track record of manipulating commodities and engaging in a lot of financial criminality that they've never really been held accountable for, aside from, you know, maybe some multi-million-dollar fines. But
as we just heard from Whitney Webb, the process of tokenizing natural resources carries significant risks, especially when debt is used as a tool to control entire countries. These financial maneuvers don't just impact governments, they affect everyday people like us. Now let's explore further into how these economic strategies could potentially trigger a global financial crisis, leading to instability for individuals and entire economies. Whitney explains how this system can be manipulated and offers practical advice on simple steps to protect ourselves financially, from building a safety net to staying aware of the hidden risks within our global financial system. Now let's listen to more insights from Whitney Webb.
I think honestly what it says more than anything else is that most humans are good people, but they're also very trusting. And they've been too trusting in people who we have enough information on the books by now to know that a lot of the people with extreme amounts of power in our world today are not trustworthy at all, but we continue trusting them. And I think that's very problematic. And I think the fact that a lot of these actors are historically have done very dark things. I think a lot of people prefer not to think about it and prefer to have a block on it and just not interact with it at all and continue living their lives that are completely divorced from that world. But unfortunately, that world is having now more than ever an increased effect on our actual livelihoods and potentially seeking to lead us into sort of this new neo-feudal paradigm that I mentioned earlier. And so I think people need to be a lot less trusting of these particular people and of the fronts or the politicians that are rolled out to sell these agendas to us, and that we need to rely more on the people in our communities, our friend groups, and our families that we know are good, and build resilient local communities with them. Because if you like yourself and myself are concerned about an economic crisis coming down the road, it's very unlikely, if you look at historical precedent, that the government is going to actually do anything to save you, or that Wall Street will do anything to save you. It's much more likely that you'll be in a better spot to face that crisis if you build something local that can provide resilience for you and your family and your friends and your community in the face of that crisis. So I think we a lot of times, Americans and other countries as well, are sort of told that as long as we get the right guy in the White House, he'll magically fix everything, or all we need to do to ensure our country goes in the right direction is vote once every 4 years. I think it should be clear to people now more than ever that that is really very mistaken, especially now that we have two people running for office in the main parties that have both been in power before, that have been in the executive branch before, and we've seen what they've done. And I think people should focus a lot more on policy agendas rather than just rhetoric, because at the end of the day, most politicians, when they campaign, it's a sales pitch, and a lot of those people don't keep their promises once they get into office, and that's true of both Trump and the Biden-Kamala crowd. And I think people need to take more individual responsibility for their lives and stop waiting for some sort of savior to magically get in the White House to make everything better. So I think we've been led to believe, again, by being very trusting, that we don't have any agency to make things better. I think we absolutely do. And there are a lot more of us than there are of them. And there's power in numbers. And if people would organize on the local level, starting with making sure your friends and family are taken care of, because especially if you anticipate things are just going to get very crazy, which seems increasingly likely, whether it's in an economic sense or a social sense, making sure you have some sort of stability or network to fall back on, I think is a very, very, very important.
To watch the full interview, check the link in the description below. In this conversation, Whitney Webb reveals the serious financial implications of turning natural resources into assets and how debt manipulation factors into global economic control. We'd love to hear your thoughts on a few questions. What do you think about the concept of tokenizing nature? Do you believe it could benefit or harm the global economy? And more importantly, are you personally prepared for potential financial shifts that may be on the horizon? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe, like, and share our video for more engaging content exploring the innovative world of decentralization.